Welcome to 3D Fluff Volume 6. This DVD is about making a honey commercial from start to finish, including all the modelling, texturing, lighting, animation and rendering. Before we start any of the modelling, I'd like to make sure that your viewport looks the same as the one we've got here. So we're going to need to change some of the default display settings. Let's make a cube, and in the viewport menu, go to Edit Configure. Make sure you're on the display page and the two options called Select Bounding Box and Select Wireframe. These are usually on by default. In my opinion, they kind of clutter up the viewport you've got. It's usually information you don't need to see because you generally know what you have selected. Let's switch both of these off, including the children settings just to the right. Okay, that's one thing done. Next, I'd like to convert this cube to a polygon object and add a HyperNURBS in the scene. Drag the cube inside and switch on polygon mode. Let's select one of these polygons here. By default, the option called Use Isolone Editing is turned off. That's underneath the Tools menu. So by default, this is what it's going to be looking like. You can see the HyperNURBS shape as well as the original low resolution cage model. Again, this is just another thing which can be cluttering up your view. So personally, we'll be using just the Isolone editing. It's a lot cleaner. We really don't need to see that original cage model. Actually, in the filter menu in the viewport, there's also another option to show the HyperNURBS cage. This is just an additional level of filter. What you can also do to simplify this a bit further is change the viewports from wireframe down to isopalms. This will reduce the number of lines which you see on your surfaces. Now we only see the original number of subdivisions and not the additional ones created by the HyperNURBS. Okay, let's close this down and give ourselves a blank scene. First of all, I want to model a flower pot. Because for this commercial we're going to need a flower pot, a bee and a pod of honey. Oh, and also a text object for the end. Since the flower pot is the simplest of all the models, we'll start there. After that we'll be modelling the flower, the bee, the honey pot and the text. So let's start with the flower pot. Bring up the snapping palette by pressing P on your keyboard. And let's switch on the 2D snapping. The two grid snapping options we need are turned on by default. If we want, we can make this palette stick in place by picking this little thin bar at the top. This will snap off this menu. So we need 2D snapping, grid snapping and grid line snapping. So let's start off by selecting a linear spline and click and drag to create spline points using the grid as a reference. You can click and drag to make these snap onto those grid points. Make a simple shape like this one. Now you can use the Move tool and adjust the positions, or you can use the Control key with the Move tool to add new points onto the spline. So, Control click on the spline to add new points, and then you can move these around. Okay, that's roughly what this should look like. Of course, a flower pot is a solid object. It has an inner and an outer surface. We don't have to create the entire inner surface, but we will need to make the lip around the top of the flower pot. And switch off snapping now, otherwise it'll get in the way. We're going to make a new point. When you have the control key held down and you click, it will add a point to the end of the spline. But it depends which way round you've drawn that spline. So if this new point is appearing on the wrong end, hold down Shift and Control and it will appear on the opposite end. To make sure these line up properly, let's use the rectangle selection, select both points, and then in the coordinates manager, set the size down to 0. This will be the x-axis, we have to set this to 0. Okay, by doing that they will then both be perfectly aligned. The next step is to round off these corners. So let's select all these points here. Basically all the points apart from the ones at the start and the end. And then we'll go to the structure menu and the edit spline submenu and select chamfer. Now click and drag the mouse in the viewport to round off the corners. Make sure that you don't click on the actual axes, just click anywhere in the blank area. And by doing this, the spline will be changed into a Bezier spline. It will be changed from a linear one. The spline needs tangent handles to make this curve, so Cinema will automatically change it for us. Okay, that's the profile for the flower pot done. Now we need to add a lathe NURBS and drag the spline into this to get the final shape. And as you can see, the subdivisions in the lathe NURBS might be a bit low. Let's increase this to 36. Or maybe even 48. It depends how close we're going to get to this in the final rendering. To make this flower pot a little less wide, we'll go back to the front view and shift these points towards the middle of the flower pot. In this case towards the right, but again it depends which way you've drawn your flower pot spline. You can do this in the 3D view as well, but make sure you click on the actual axes to lock a single direction. As we said earlier, there's going to be a bit of soil in the flower pot, otherwise it would be a bit of a dead plant. For this we're just going to use a disk object. All we need to do is move and scale it. A bit like this. And we'll make it slightly intersect into the flower pot at the top. Now we're going to make this an editable object. Now I'm going to tear off the selection menu here because we're going to be clicking these commands quite a few times and it's a bit laborious going up into that menu each and every time. Okay, select ring selection and use it to select this ring of polygons here. You might need to move your mouse around a little bit until it highlights the correct ring. Now what we're going to do is we're going to shift these up just a little bit. It does look a lot better if this soil isn't completely flat. Okay, and let's also select an inner ring of polygons and move this down a little bit. By disrupting the surface here, it should get some much more interesting lighting. Okay, rename this to something obvious like soil. Now rename the NURBS here to pot. Then group everything together and we'll name the whole object flower pot. Okay, next thing to do is model a flower to go inside.